Good morning. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm the Director of Housing Advocacy at the Community Development Partnership, and this is the kickoff for our 2021 to 2022 Lower Cape Housing Institute with a workshop on Housing 101. This year we opened it up to the general public, so we should have a nice mix of people who both work in town hall or volunteer on a board or committee in town hall, consider themselves a housing advocate or maybe a housing advocate in training, or might work for a nonprofit or a social service organization that serves our local communities here on the Lower Cape. I'm joined today by our CEO, Jay Coburn, who's going to be co-presenting with me this morning, as well as my colleagues, Pelinda Deegan and Nina Cantor. Are there any other colleagues on here yet? Maybe not yet. Sorry if I don't see your face. I'm going to share my screen. All right, let's get started. So Jay, can you kick us off with a welcome?
Super. Thank you, Andrea and Pelinda, for putting together this presentation and organizing it all today. As Andrea said, I'm Jay Coburn. I'm the CEO of the Community Development Partnership, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to do over the next 2 hours. So this presentation is built on one we did about a year ago, and it's really designed to lay the foundation for an understanding of the complexity of the creation of affordable housing, and particularly the challenges that we face here on the Lower and Outer Cape. And so we're going to talk about housing and why it's important to a healthy, vibrant, diverse community. Who the people that need housing, particularly in our communities, what housing can look like in a variety of different forms, particularly that would depart from our reliance on single family houses on 1-acre lots, which is about 90% of the housing on the Lower Cape. We're going to talk a bit about the process of how we create housing, how we build it, and what are the ingredients and secret sauce to kind of make sure that we get the best housing that's most responsive to the needs of our community. And then we will wrap it up. A little bit about questions throughout. If we would like to try to reserve the last quarter of the time for questions and conversation. And so if you can hold your question till then, that would be great. If it's something that's burning, however, that you just really need to have a bit more understanding, please feel free to use the raise your hand function at the bottom, or to just go, if a question is coming up for you, go ahead and put it in the chat, and then Pelinda will be kind of going through those questions and flagging ones that we need to answer right away, or questions that we can wait until the end. So with that, let's talk a little bit about some of the learning guidelines I'm sorry, let's talk a little bit about who's here today. Yeah,
we're just going to do a quick little poll. So we're just going to take like half a minute. 2 things. Number 1, if you haven't already, please rename your Hollywood Square so it has your name and the town that you're in. That would be really helpful for us. And we're going to launch a poll right now, and just take a couple seconds to answer these questions, please.
Sorry, Andrea, I think my poll is inactive for some reason.
I just launched it because I saw that you lost hostability.
Oh, okay.
And we're getting some answers. If anyone's on their phone and can't see the poll, we're asking what your role is, whether you're on a town board or committee, part of a nonprofit, a housing advocate or community member, or town staff. And then we're also asking which subregion you're affiliated, whether you consider yourself to be part of the Outer Cape, the Lower Cape, Mid and Upper Cape, or Off Cape. All right, most of you have answered, so I'm going to end the poll. Can you all see the results? Cool. So it's just nice to know who's in the room, right? This Housing Institute, we'll talk about that a little bit in a second, is really designed primarily for people who are working within town hall or volunteering in town hall. And that's the majority of people who are here. So that's great. But I'm really happy to see that there are other folks as well. And then most of all of us are from the region that we serve. So that's perfect. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it back over to you, Jay.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. So let's talk a little bit about just some learning guidelines. We hope that you'll share the air and that will kind of create an opportunity for everyone who's got questions or comments to be able to do so, that we balance inquiry with advocacy. Certainly comments and sharing knowledge are important, but as to our questions. And two, we hope we have the opportunity to share with others as we're going through the presentation, and particularly doing questions and comments at the end.
There you go.
And then just quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the CDP, we are the region's nonprofit community development corporation, serving all of the 8 Lower Cape towns. And our mission as an organization is to build a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. To do that, we engage in a whole variety of different programs, from developing, managing, creating, and advocating for affordable housing. We also nurture and launch and help grow small businesses throughout the region. And then we also work to facilitate collaboration between businesses, the nonprofit community, and our government partners.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. Briefly, this is a program that the CDP launched in 2017. I'm not going to get into the details of why. We have a lot of content to cover in a relatively short period of time, but suffice it to say that we realized that our region just really wasn't set up for success to handle the major housing crisis that's in front of us. And so we developed this program to help the Lower Cape meet the housing needs of our community in 3 ways. The first way is through this Lower Cape Housing Institute. The Lower Cape Housing Institute takes place from fall to basically early summer every year, and it includes a slate of programming that is it includes workshops like this one. It also includes peer groups. So we facilitate a Lower Cape and an Outer Cape peer group meeting, and that's quarterly, and you are welcome to join. That is specifically for municipal officials. We also go through all of the annual town meeting warrants and pull out all the housing articles so that we can analyze success in terms of what's passed at town meeting and how many dollars have been allocated to housing. We have a monthly e-newsletter that's for anyone who cares about housing on the Lower Cape, and it's chock full of updates about what's going on in each town. It's probably the easiest way to keep up to date with what's going on in the region. And then we also have a Facebook group that we'll invite you to, where you can feel comfortable asking questions, sharing ideas. Really, it's yours. It's a private space. We also have a Lower Cape Housing Advocacy Program that has kind of morphed over the years from a training program to more of a community organizing program. And we have partnered with an organization called Citizens Housing and Planning Association to launch some coalitions in towns that are interested. More on that if you read our newsletter. And then we also have a public media campaign, which we'll show you later, that's used to show the true face of people who live in or need housing and to build public support for housing. Outside of this, we've also been offering housing consulting services to Lower Cape towns for a couple of years now. A couple of housekeeping matters. You will be getting a link to this presentation. You'll notice that throughout this presentation, we're really trying to help you learn how to fish rather than give you fish. So we might not go into every concept in detail, but we will link to resources. And so this presentation is a live work in progress that you'll be able to go back to over time. It'll get updated with more resources, and you can click on all the live links to dig deeper into concepts that we just don't have time to get into right now. We're not going to build in a break. I really don't like dead air on a Zoom meeting. So if you need to do anything to take care of yourself, please go ahead and do it. Feel free to turn off your video and then come back and join us when you're ready. And then, as Jay said, we're asking you to keep most of your questions till the end, posting them in the chat. If you have a burning question, you can raise your hand using the Zoom raise your hand feature. If you just raise your physical hand, we might not catch you because there's a lot going on. So there should be an option at the bottom, I believe, under reactions here to raise your hand. That'll make it really easy for us. And we'll try and call on 1 or 2 people at the end of each section. But for the most part, we would prefer that you keep your questions to the end, and we'll address them then. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what housing is and why it's important. So housing is where we live our lives. It's really critical to having a healthy, thriving community and local economy. Safe, stable, affordable housing is the foundation of a healthy life and a healthy community. There's a lot of pieces that make up a healthy community. Housing is one of them. Housing can be a mobile home, it can be a single family home, it can be an apartment. There's lots of different types of housing that are recognized. But I think the most important thing to understand about housing is that you cannot bring your true self or your full self to any aspect of your life, whether it's work or your relationships, if you don't have safe, stable housing at the core of it. A lot of times when we're talking about the housing crisis, we tend to use language that comes from a place of lack, right? Like we don't have enough housing, we're in a crisis, we're always talking about the downside, but it can be really helpful, both from a messaging perspective and also just from like being in a problem-solving frame of mind, to think about the flip side. Like what would a community look like if we did have a healthy supply of housing? It helps you be more in like this creative visionary space. And so we really encourage people when they're advocating for housing to talk about why it's so important to have housing for all in your community and what the benefits to your community are when your community members, neighbors, families, and friends are well housed. So a community that has a healthy supply of housing should look really good. There should be a diverse range of building sizes, types, these communities that have diverse, what's called housing typology, housing types. So when we're talking about housing types, we're talking about anything from a single family home all the way up to a big high rise, and there's lots of stuff in between. And it's the stuff in the between that we're really missing in our communities here. It can break up roof lines. It can look really quaint. A lot of communities that we think are charming and quaint actually have lots of diverse housing types made up in them. I also want to say that we're going to be talking more about how you can use this broad range of housing types called the missing middle housing in a workshop coming up this winter called Community by Design. And we'll send you links to that. A community with a healthy supply of housing is energy efficient. It is building housing that is planning for the effects of climate change. It's really important to have housing that is energy efficient for climate change, but also for the people who live in it. Energy efficiency is a piece of housing affordability. By using less energy, you also make energy bills, right, cheaper for residents. So energy efficient building is more economical for the people who live there. But I think more importantly, part of energy efficiency is where you site housing, making sure that it is in close proximity to transportation, work, commerce. This is what we call village-centered growth. It's smart growth in other places, but we're not big cities, we're small towns. So we really advocate for having housing built as close to town center as possible, where people can walk to work, imagine that, where people can walk to services and amenities, and they can limit the amount of trips that they're making in their cars.
Andrea, can I just say one other thing about the energy efficiency issue too? So, you may have read in the paper that we currently have a proposal for 46 units of housing in Wellfleet. And that project is a combination of townhomes, but also a 3-story apartment building with 22 units in it. That development will be net zero in energy consumption. The development will contain solar panels, but also with very high quality construction. But it is that building that can house 22 families that is going to be the most energy efficient. And so the least energy efficient kind of construction are single family houses spread throughout the landscape.
Thank you. I think to me, the most important thing about a community with a healthy supply of housing is that it's called healthy because it has housing for people at all stages of life and people who live there with different income ranges. And so that means that you have an economically and hopefully also racially diverse community. And that links directly to the types of housing that are available to people in your community. If you only have one type of housing, it's only going to be available to people with one income range or one life experience, and then you don't have a diverse community at all. And our local economies depend heavily on having diverse experiences, diverse skill sets to be able to run. Anything you want to add to that, Jay? Okay. And here's a concept I wanted to introduce you to. It's called the 15-minute neighborhood. It comes out of the planning world. And it's just a nice concept for kind of thinking about how you want to be building your village centers. The idea is that it's a geographic ideal where it only takes 15 minutes to get to meet any of your needs and desires, right? So work, home, grocery shopping, coffee shops, all of these things can be reached within, say, a 15-minute walk, which is about 3/4 of a mile. And if you think about building your village centers like that, it makes perfect sense for housing to be in the core of it. And I've included a link at the bottom to read more about the 15-minute city. You can just substitute neighborhood for city. And I think that it will give you some useful ways of talking about village-centered growth. And so what is affordable housing? This is a question that I get a lot from people who are new to boards and committees. And I think it's because it can mean a lot of things. It kind of depends on the context. There are a lot of terms related with the housing world. And there's no way we're going to get into all the terms right now. And we'll do our best to not use acronyms. But what I highly recommend is go to this link. It's from a publication called Shelter Force, which is an online publication that I highly recommend subscribing to if you can. I don't know if they're still doing prints. They did before. It's really structured around community development, but it talks a ton about housing and really useful in terms of messaging. Anyway, this links directly to a glossary of terms that you will certainly interface with as you go through your housing advocacy and housing production journey. But when we talk about affordability, we're basically saying that a household is not spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. So that can be your rent, your mortgage, your utilities. If a household is spending more than 30% on housing costs, then they are considered to be cost burdened. And you'll see this term cost burdened come up later. And this is also just a point for me to say that when we're talking about housing, we talk about housing units, and the people side of that is a household. We generally don't talk about people, we talk about households. That's like the unit of housing that we discuss. It's just something to keep in mind. Another thing I want to say is that until about the 80s, affordability was defined as spending no more than 25% of your income on housing costs, and the Reagan administration increased that to 30%. And the only reason why I mention that is because there was a very, very long time, like almost 100 years, where people thought that spending more than 25% would call you cost burden, would mean you were cost burden. So 30% can still be tight for some folks. You also might have heard of this big A versus small a affordable. So big A affordable refers specifically to regulated affordable housing. It's a big A because it's regulated by the government, by the state, and it's subsidized. And we'll talk about that again in a second. Small a is this like normal rental market. So there are places in the country, not here, but there are places in the country where people can just afford to rent an apartment and it's not subsidized and it's not big A affordable. That's called a naturally occurring or normal rental market. That's small a. We don't have that here. We don't have a normal market where it's easy to just go find an apartment. Even if people can afford to buy an apartment, we also have very low housing stock. We know that we have an effective 0% vacancy in most of our lower Cape towns. So those are two different pieces. One is the amount of supply, the amount of housing stock we have is low. That's called low housing inventory. And then there's also your vacancy rate, which says that even if there is a unit that someone can afford, they can't even find it. And we see that all the time with, responses on Craigslist going in the hundreds when something is posted right away. So this is the naturally occurring affordable housing. The home is owned by the private sector, right? Which is someone is just a landlord and they rent out a unit. The unit was built without government subsidy. It doesn't receive any subsidies for operations, and there really isn't much of it. One way of increasing naturally occurring affordable housing is by making it easier for homeowners to build an accessory dwelling unit. So over the past few years, we've seen towns pass accessory dwelling unit bylaws known as ADUs that are a little more expansive, that make it easier for homeowners to be able to build one if they want to. And this is a way of adding more housing stock to our communities without going around existing zoning, because it's already what the site can hold in terms of number of bedrooms. And then again, this capital A is subsidized and regulated. A capital A housing is serving households below 100% of area median income, and that is driven by the funding. So the subsidy that is received dictates who can live there in terms of what their income is. And it's actually usually about 80% or below, but there's funding that can support up to 100%. And again, it's highly regulated by the state. Related to this capital A affordable, you've probably heard of Chapter 40B. It is a misconception that towns are required to have 10% of their housing be affordable. Chapter 40B says that every municipality has an obligation to provide at least 10% of their housing stock to be affordable. And it does this through an incentive program. But the important thing to know about Chapter 40B is that it's a statute and it's the #1 vehicle for permitting affordable housing. It has produced the most affordable housing in the state, whether you like it or not, that's just a fact. And the 10% year-round, the 10% obligation, something that people don't realize is that it's 10% of your year-round housing stock is affordable. So you could have, that 10% does not mean 10% of your total housing stock. It's only 10% of your year-round housing stock. And this is particularly relevant on the Lower and Outer Cape, where we have a lot of our housing stock is seasonal, and that is not counted in the 10%. So the reason why I say this is that some people think that once you get to 10%, you're good. That's not true. That's a floor. The 10% is an absolute minimum. And even though you, when you get to 10%, even though you will have met this incentive, which I'll mention in a second, you still want to keep going because the 10% is not sufficient to meet our communities as those units are being switched to seasonal use rather than year-round use. So the carrot that Chapter 40B uses is it says that if you get to 10% and you have what's called a certified housing production plan, all towns have these plans that are called housing production plans that say what you're going to produce within a certain number of years, then you can enter into what's called safe harbor. And safe harbor means that if a developer comes through and uses Chapter 40B to apply for what's called a comprehensive permit, a town can reject it. Before you get to 10%, the town cannot reject it. They have to provide conditions, or if they do reject it, it'll go into appeal and probably lose. Chapter 40B process can be a little complicated. The only people who really truly need to understand it are the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Appeals. And if you want to get really deep into every step of the process that a ZBA goes through when a developer comes through to apply for a comprehensive permit, you can click on the link on the right. There's a great handbook for ZBAs and it gets into all the nitty-gritty. The last thing I want to share is that this success toward 10% is tracked through a list called the Subsidized Housing Inventory, which is exactly what it sounds like. Every town maintains a list of the units in their town that are subsidized. And that is what they use to determine whether or not a town has gotten to their 10%. Another typical way that units get produced without a state subsidy is through a LIP program, the Local Initiative Program. This is basically a state program that encourages affordable housing by providing support. And when towns go through the LIP program, they're signaling that they are working together with the developer to create housing. There was a link in there to learn more about that as well. So why don't we have a healthy supply of housing on the Lower Cape? And Jay, feel free to jump in if I'm missing anything. The first thing I want to, this isn't a why, this is more of a how. The affordability gap is a concept to help us understand housing stress. When we can understand the town's affordability gap, we will understand just how much housing is missing or will be missing. It represents a number of existing households that are cost burdened, so are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. So in the Outer Cape, without getting into this too much, it's basically showing on the bottom, the dots are showing an area median income. So when we talk about income, we talk about area median income as opposed to like straight up salaries. And we talk about 30%, 50%, 80%, 100% of area median income being the, well, to 80% is the low income. 100% is right in the middle. So half of the people in your communities make less than that and the other half make more than that. It's a median, it's not an average, it's a median. And then above 100% is considered moderate income. So we're looking here at the dots and it's showing us that at these specific area median incomes, 50, 80, 100, 120, the number of households on the left are going to be cost burdened by 2025. So we can see here in Provincetown that while there's always need for people who have lower incomes, there is a serious gap for households that make more than 100% of area median income, even up to 120 and probably higher than that. And that's not surprising for Provincetown, but we do see a similar dynamic on the Lower Cape and it's stretching across the rest of the Cape as well. So in Harwich, we can see that by 2025, many households will be cost burdened at the lower income ranges. But then when you get to that 100 and 120, there's still over 100 households that are cost burdened. And so the message here is that the affordability gap is a tool to help us understand affordability issues in our region, and also that we need housing for people at all income ranges, not just the lower end. And I also want to stress that we still need a lot of housing for people who make 30% or less. And we'll talk a little bit about how we know that shortly. Okay, so as for the why. Why don't we have housing? Well, I think the main reason is this market disconnection. In most communities, you have your local economy, and then you have your local housing market. And the people who are part of that economy are buying or renting in that local housing market. But that's not how it works on the Cape, because our housing market has nothing to do with our local economy. It's really driven by people who are off Cape, who are purchasing second homes with higher salaries than we have in our region, or renting it out seasonally. A piece of this is that our land values are really high because we have a lot of competition. It's just basic the supply and demand. We have a low supply of housing and a high demand for that housing. And on top of that, so that drives real estate prices up. And that makes the cost of building very expensive because land is part of the cost of building. Labor out here is also very expensive. So the cost of building is one reason why our housing market is challenging. We also have zoning patterns that focus primarily on single family homes on 1 acre lots, which is the most expensive way to build. So one of the things that we're going to be advocating for is diversifying your zoning by allowing for multifamily, otherwise known as apartments or townhomes, or any time where you have more than one household in a building. Jay, do you know anything
Andre,
about yeah.
I'm going to just go back to just really emphasize the bottom point too, is that, you know, if we're looking at projects that are either in the process of being built or just have been built, the typical unit of affordable housing costs $400,000 to build. And about 20% of the cost of that are what we call soft costs. So that's the permitting, that's the design, the engineering, the profit to the developer who builds it. But that's what it costs to create housing in our community, and those costs are continuing to increase as well.
Do you know if that per unit cost has changed post-COVID or during COVID?
I don't think it's been evaluated post-COVID to kind of take into account the fluctuations in the cost of building materials.
Got it. As I mentioned, it's just to highlight that we have a lot of second home purchasers here on the Cape. Actually, half of the vacation homes in the entire state are here on the Cape, and that just puts more pressure on our housing market. It means that our year-round residents are competing with people who have much more buying power than they do. And then, of course, because we have, an economy that's based on tourism and hospitality, we have a very active seasonal and short-term rental market. And the dynamic that's going on here is that it is far more lucrative for people to purchase a second home, rent it out seasonally, and either leave it vacant or use it for the rest of the year and make more money than they would if they rented it out year round. And so we're going to share with you this example from Provincetown. So Provincetown commissioned this report from UMass Dartmouth called Understanding the Housing Needs and Challenges Facing Provincetown. And what they found was that if you look at the median rent the 2-bedroom unit can get in Provincetown, it's about $12,000 to $15,000 per year. But if you look at the average rental rate for an Airbnb in Provincetown is about $254 per night. So if you think about someone who is renting out their unit in Provincetown for 20 weeks between May and September, they can get $34,493 in rental income, which is a net gain of over $18,000 just to keep that unit as a short-term rental, and they still get to use it for most of the year. So there just isn't any incentive for a lot of people to rent year-round. And so that's why we tend to be a little skeptical in the Lower Cape specifically when there's talks about people providing incentives to homeowners to rent year-round, because unless they can make up that difference, it's just really not going to make a difference to the housing market. It would also be a very expensive way of dealing with the housing crisis. Anything you want to add there, Jay?
Yeah, and just to your point of being expensive, typically in a large affordable housing development that a town plays a role in with a developer, the town is putting in between $30,000 and $40,000 a unit, and securing with that $30,000 to $40,000 is securing an affordable unit forever. Whereas if we were to try to close that gap and provide some sort of subsidy to homeowners, we're talking about $18,000 a year. And so I've been quoted as saying the only way out of our affordable housing crisis is really to build our way out of it. And why I say that is that it's just not economically feasible to subsidize existing units to get them to stay in as year-round rentals, given the market pressures that come from seasonal rentals through Airbnb, VRBO, and those sources.
All right, so another major barrier to dealing with the housing crisis is just our current zoning. Our zoning makes, basically people are going to build whatever is easiest to build. And so towns make it really easy for people to build single family homes on 1-acre lots by not expanding zoning to include what's called multifamily. So this is definitely something that we are going to be talking about as being an easy fix for dealing with the housing crisis, is just literally make it easier for us to build more housing. That is why developers have to use Chapter 40B by applying for a comprehensive permit, is to get around these zoning restrictions without having any detrimental effects on the environment. It can still be difficult to add accessory dwelling units, even though towns have made great efforts to expand their bylaws, because there's a lot of other pieces to building what's called an ADU. It's complicated for the average homeowner to go through the process at town hall. They might not be able to afford building a new unit. Some towns in the past have required affordability restrictions. We're seeing those go away, but affordability restrictions were a major deterrent to building ADUs. We really haven't seen towns do more than 10 or so a year. That's starting to change. But in order to have the kind of groundswell of ADU production that some people hope for, we really need to remove a lot of other barriers aside from just the zoning piece. And then, of course, I don't think any towns allow multifamily by right in village centers. Maybe some do. That might be changing, but that's definitely going to be the main piece to deal with the housing crisis moving forward. Infrastructure. So what you can build on a piece of land in order to protect the environment, particularly the water table and nitrogen issues, is by having municipal infrastructure. So if you don't have public water and you don't have town sewer, your allowable density is going to be lower. Conversely, if you have public water and you have sewer, you can build more and you can do it safely. Communities in the past historically have chosen not to allow town water and town sewer to be approved at town meeting, specifically to hinder developments, including housing development. That's a really old strategy, and we still see that today. Yeah, is there anything else I want to say about that? Anything else? Yeah. I guess the only other thing I would say is that infrastructure is a huge piece of housing production. So anything that you can do to support infrastructure development, we would say, is a housing advocacy issue. And then a big piece, of course, yeah.
There are also definitely some progress being, happening there. I mean, in Chatham and Provincetown, there's a lot more options for housing because of the existence of wastewater treatment facilities. The sewering of a significant portion of Orleans is going to open up lots of possibilities for better housing options. And there's even some discussion in Wellfleet, where we're proposing to build these 46 units. The town has gotten together to tie together the elementary school, the police department, the fire department, and this development to have a small wastewater treatment plant to cover all that area. Anytime a municipality can kind of create that kind of infrastructure, it really unlocks a lot more possibilities for housing development.
Thank you. And then a huge hindrance to our housing production is just the lack of public support. I do think that this is shifting slowly. Things are getting a little bit better in terms of the rhetoric that we see, like at town meeting or even online on social media. But still, it only takes one abutter to hold a development up in court for many, many years, perhaps long enough to make the development pull out. And it only takes a handful of really loud, angry voices to really slow down a process or create or focus on issues that really are kind of red herrings. So it's absolutely critical for you all as housing advocates to be just as loud as those who are disagreeing with housing development. So a couple of things I wanted you to know. Part of understanding the lack of public support is understanding who historically has been in the room pushing decision-making from the public. So Boston University did this study a few years ago called Who Participates in Local Government. I've linked it here. I highly recommend that you look into it. The finding was that individuals who are older, male, and white are generally the loudest voices in a planning board meeting. And so that means that they are affecting land use policy and housing policy in our communities. They're obviously not elected or appointed, but they're very loud and they represent a very singular perspective and experience. And so part of battling the lack of public support is by creating spaces and supporting advocates who might not feel as entitled or comfortable to speak up in these meetings, to share their opinion, to share the other side of the story, to share their own experience. And when we talk about people who don't support housing, we perhaps somewhat derogatorily call them NIMBYs. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. There is another side to this, which is YIMBY. There's a whole national campaign that says yes in my backyard. But the term NIMBY refers to someone who might be totally for affordable housing, just not here. And you'll always see that whenever a housing development is being proposed, that there are people who are flat out against it, and there are people who really think it's great, just not here, even if here might be the best possible place for the development. And what's really interesting, not to be sort of flip, but what's interesting is that the arguments against any development generally fall under the same few categories. We actually hear them over and over and over. And the reason why that's important to know is that it actually makes it really easy to anticipate what's going to be said so that you can prepare for them and address them in any public forum that you possibly can. So the categories that these concerns typically fall under are Fiscal concerns, which in a lot of communities is really about kids in the community. Traffic is a big one, density, of course. And then there's this like nebulous, something about the people that are going to be there. So the best way to counter these arguments is with data. So we're going to offer you some data points that you should always know so that you can explain the value of the project and why the concerns are perhaps not valid. But I will say sometimes concerns are valid, and so we have to address them with data and respectfully. So when it comes to fiscal concerns, there's this concern about higher pressure on services like police and fire. But in the Lower Cape, we have this hyper-seasonal economy where our population just balloon in the summer, and we've actually planned for peak need for summer residents, for people who don't even live here year-round. So the idea that we don't have that capacity just doesn't really square with the truth. We also see people complain a lot that a development is going to bring a lot of children. The data actually shows that single-family homes tend to have more children than multifamily affordable housing homes. That's just a fact. So this idea that affordable housing is going to bring more children into our communities is not really well founded. However, that's not as important as the fact that communities need children. We need children to perpetuate the species. We should have spaces in our communities that allow for people to have children, because you literally cannot have a community without people, and all people start as children. Traffic. Two pieces to traffic. One is, rather than letting conversations devolve into all of the concerns around traffic, you could just commission a peer-reviewed traffic study and just know what the impact of a housing development will be on traffic. Oftentimes, our perceptions do not align with the reality. And so while one might assume that a large development would really negatively impact traffic, a traffic report can tell you that maybe it does, or more likely it probably doesn't add that many more trips. The other piece of traffic is that, again, go for village-centered development. The more that people are able to live close to amenities, close to work, the less traffic there will be. So there's that. And these are, on all these slides, we're just giving you specific data points that you can go find to support your efforts. Density. So density is probably one of the things that always comes up at the top. People have a knee-jerk reaction to density. When we say density, we're talking about the number of housing units per a unit of land, like the number of housing units per acre, for example. And a lot of times people will say, that's too dense, whatever the number is, that doesn't fit here. But what they really usually mean, if you dig deeper, is they think that something more dense is going to be ugly. They're really concerned about the looks. And those are two separate matters. You can have something that's very low density that looks terrible, and you can have something higher density that looks great. So when it comes to density, we really encourage you to not talk about the number of units of the site, because it's really irrelevant. We want to be talking about maximizing the potential of a site when we're doing housing development. What we do want to focus on is what it's going to look like. Talk about design, don't talk about density, because people just have an immediate reaction to 50, 100, 20, whatever it is. Everyone's different. Don't focus on that. It's going to derail the conversation really quickly. Talk about design elements that you think fit within your community. People talk a lot about character. Not everyone agrees on what character is. It's a really nebulous kind of concept. But you can talk about specific things: roof lines, porches, materials. There are design elements that you can talk about to bring people on board to being open to a housing development without talking about how many people are going to live there or the characteristics of those people. We encourage you to focus on the building and not what's going on inside the building. And then, of course, we just have to mention, sometimes people just don't want housing because they have biases around demographic elements like race or economic status, and those are discriminatory and have no founding in a conversation about whether development has merits. So what we really encourage you to do is, when you hear those kinds of dog whistles, when you hear people using messaging that is discriminatory, please call it out. Don't let it float in the ether as fact. Make sure that you name it, call it out, and address it. Also, I think it's kind of funny that it seems like most people agree that we need to attract young families back to the Cape. but young families need more than one bedroom. And even though there's a lot of need for one bedrooms, you're not going to be able to have young families unless you have places for them to live. So we have to make sure that our goals and our production is in line with our values. I think that's the end of my piece. So before I hand it off to Jay for who needs it, we don't have any hands, do we? Any burning questions? Okay, good. Jay, on to you.
All right, so let's talk about who needs housing. So we actually need housing, and particularly on the lower and outer Cape, at all different income levels. And here's another great article in Shelter Force that talks about the shortage of housing at a variety of different income levels. So let's look at some of the data in our community. It's really important to have a good understanding in your particular town as well as the region of what our housing needs are. And there are a bunch of different sources of this kind of data. So the income levels, the area median income, that comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's updated every spring. The Cape Cod Commission is a great source of housing data, both on a town and regional level, and particularly the Regional Housing Market Analysis and 10-year forecast that was published in 2017 is a great source. Also, the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, which is one of the state housing agencies, has a Center for Housing Data called Datatown. And you can get really great information on your town and compare that to averages in the state. There's also mapping software. Stats Cape Cod is a website maintained by the Cape Cod Commission with lots of good data, and Stats America is also another great data source. So let's kind of look at our regional housing market. So this chart shows how seasonal seasonal housing is really growing at a faster rate than year-round housing, and that continues to kind of create that gap that we have in our community, where more of the housing that's being built is going to short-term, and we're not keeping up with the growth that we're seeing in population, and we've seen some significant growth in population in the last 10 years, that we're not creating that kind of housing. So let's talk a bit about population growth on the lower and outer Cape. So this is from the 2010 versus the 2020 census, and you can see that in all 8 lower Cape towns, we've had significant population growth, and population growth that has been ahead of the statewide growth of about 6%. And that growth has been particularly strong on the outer Cape, with Wellfleet at a high of 29% population growth over the last 10 years. And I'd also just add, if you look at some of that, do a little deeper dive into some of that data too, a lot of that growth is actually coming from a more diverse population. For example, the town of Provincetown now has 15% of the population of Provincetown are people of color. We also have a problem with rising prices and low inventory. And you can see that this is 2019 through 2021 in Barnstable County, how the median home price has gone up $150,000. Yet the inventory of houses that are like on the market has gone from 2,000 to less than 600 houses that are available. And so that is another thing that's really tightening the squeeze on our housing supply here. It's more expensive and there's less of it. So let's also dive a little bit into understanding the need. So we need more housing for people making low and moderate incomes. And The greatest need is for those with very, very low income. So these are families that are making 30% of area median income. So a family that's earning less than $30,000 a year, people with low wage, minimum wage jobs, or who are living on Social Security or Social Security disability. And so one of the ways that we can assess that need is in each of our towns having affordable housing studies. So every single Lower Cape town has a housing production plan that really outlines what the needs are in terms of income levels, the number of families that are cost burdened, and the number of units that are needed to meet current needs of the residents of that community.
And Jay, what we're showing here are other types of assessments that are not housing production plans. So one of the things that we advocate for at the CDP is to go beyond a housing production plan. A housing production plan is really like a state mandated template that tends to kind of codify what you've already done and maybe what you're going to do in the next few years. It doesn't really lay out a long-term strategic vision. You can do that with other assessments, like Brewster did this long visioning plan that they always update. Provincetown has a community housing playbook in addition to this report they commissioned. Do whatever you need to do to fully understand the housing need in your community. And then the other thing I wanted to add here, Jay, is the reason why we want to emphasize this point that households that are making 30% of area median income have a lot of need is because there's a lot of excitement and interest right now in developing what's called community housing. Some people refer to it as workforce housing. This is for the higher income, the more moderate income. But we know from recent lotteries through Community Housing Resource that just did a lottery for their wait list, and also the lottery for the Village at Nauset Green in Eastham, that among hundreds of applicants, most of the applicants had incomes at 30% or below. So there is still tremendous need in that income range.
And we typically, in an affordable housing development, only see about 10 to 15% of the units will meet that need. So we have a lot of work to do in trying to meet very low income. So this is the chart that I was referring to that HUD updates every year, and it kind of gives you the different income areas. So we have what we call low income, so that's folks below 80%, to very low income, so that's 50% of area median income, and then the extremely low, which is 30% or less. And you can kind of see what the different income levels are there for these different categories.
Jay, we put in these how many earners does it take as a reference for people to come back to. Do you want to review it or leave it here for them to dig into?
Yeah, I think let's just look at this is a resource that's also available through the Cape Cod Commission, but it really just kind of outlines for you, you know, what different jobs are and what the income is for folks in those positions, and then therefore what kind of housing that they can afford.
And just to say that we have an Outer Cape version as well. When you're doing presentations for your community, you can ask the Cape Cod Commission to make these charts for your town. So please do use them as a resource.
So it's also, I think, really important to paint a picture of who are the people that need housing in our communities. Like, what are the jobs that are in our community, what they pay, and what kind of housing is available. So we actually, to try to paint the picture, launched a media campaign a few years ago, and did another campaign this year that talks about the people who live in our community and that are really valuable members of our community. Do you want to click that on, Andrea? So it's called "We Can't Afford to Lose the People Who Can't Afford to Live Here," and it tells the story of a small business owner, a young family, and a senior retired couple, and the challenges that they've faced. And it's both print ads as well as videos for each of these stories.
And you can download these on your website and use them to help make the case in your community.
Yeah.
And then Jay, we had also put this video here for people to refer back to rather than play it, but maybe you can explain what it is.
Sure. So the CDP manages Harbor Hill for the town of Provincetown. Harbor Hill is housing, is market rate year-round rental housing for people between 80 and 200% of area median income. And in preparation for a town vote for funds for that project, we produced a video that tells the story of several of the families. There are now 28 families who live at Harbor Hill in Provincetown.
So you'll be able to click on this when you get the follow-up presentation.
And so data is really important, numbers important, but equally important are the stories. And so the more that you can tell the stories with visuals, know the data, talk about the future of the data, but really those stories, I think, are the things that are most powerful.
All right. Any questions? Can we move on? Everybody already knows all this stuff. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what it can look like. So historically, I think some people who aren't in the housing space have created these misconceptions about what affordable housing is, because in the past, it used to be a lot of people with the same income and same kind of life experience and demographics all piled into one area and basically segregated from the rest of the community. Thanks to the Fair Housing Act, you can't do that anymore. So the Fair Housing Act really allowed for more diversity and mobility in our housing markets. And now affordable housing is mixed income. Mixed income means that it could include capital A affordable units and non-subsidized market rate units, all in the same neighborhood. And that's really what we want to see and what we advocate for. It's a much healthier way to do housing development for a variety of reasons. And part of that means that we really don't see much age-restricted housing anymore, any senior housing. And we do really encourage towns to try to get away from having age-restricted senior housing because it excludes children. You can deal with it by your bedroom mix. And really, housing now is intergenerational. Nobody wants to live with only people just like them. Seniors want to live with other people too. And so we really are moving toward this intergenerational mixed income type of housing development. I guess another piece of that, Jay, is that from a financing perspective, the market rate units in some communities can help cover the costs of the affordable units that need subsidy.
Although that is difficult to do out here on the Lower Cape in the rental housing market, because our rents are just, in Boston, where their rents are $3,000 and $4,000 a month for a market rate rental, the numbers work and the market rate can subsidize the affordable. It's more difficult to do that here, particularly with the smaller scale projects that we build. Although there is a proposal for 96 units of rental housing in Harwich, 26 of them would be affordable, and that project won't require any government funds whatsoever because the market rate units are going to subsidize the affordable units.
And I think some people think that affordable housing is going to be ugly because it's built to be ugly. Affordable housing should be the same quality as housing for people in any income range, right? Like affordable housing should cost the same to build as market rate housing, barring, luxury appliances. And the design can also be beautiful. So here are some local examples. When you're talking about housing development in your town, make sure that you are aware of the affordable housing developments in your town. Bring pictures. We recommend that when you are working on any kind of community engagement for a site, that you try to conduct a visual preference survey. So a visual preference survey has people look at pictures and talk about what they like and don't like about a room, a building, rather than asking them, do you like density? Do you like affordable housing? Do you like, XYZ? Try to steer the conversation more around form, around design, and make sure that you pick examples that are in your community that are great examples of affordable housing so that everyone can kind of be on the same page about what it can look like. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that along the lines of a visual preference survey, if you look at, say, some beautiful, historic, giant single family home someone will probably say like, yes, that's beautiful. That's what we want. We don't want these apartment style buildings. But that same building could be broken up into multiple units and could be a multifamily building. It looks the same on the outside. So again, it's really about design. We can ask for design that is contextual in terms of architecture to our own communities. And that doesn't mean that it has to be ugly. Of course, there is a cost side of this. And that's why local resources are so important to subsidize housing development so that we can have the type of housing in our communities that we want. We talked a little bit about density. Density is really building densely is the most economical way to build housing. It is the only way to protect open space and green space by building up rather than out. Having zoning that allows for density means that your community can look more like a historical quaint village than suburbia. It's what we need to embrace in order to build for climate change. And like I said, it's more cost effective to build. Do you want to say something about why it's cost effective to build densely, Jay?
Sure. So you are using less land, you're spending less money laying out streets, roads, water pipes. You're preserving open space when we develop more densely. And then also when we're putting housing units, several housing units in a single building, we have fewer exterior walls. They're easier to insulate. We've got larger roofs and greater area for solar panels to make that housing a lot more energy efficient. I'd also like to say that, you know, we do seem to have this thing on Cape Cod about buildings that are 3 stories tall. You know, one of the reasons why it is so much more efficient to build a 3-story building is because, again, you're not spreading things out. You can also have, you know, in a 2-story building, you're going to need to have an elevator. An elevator costs $100,000 to install, and if it can serve a single elevator can serve more units of housing, it's more cost effective. I think one of the best ways, though, to kind of counteract this fear and this resistance of 3-story buildings is to look in the community, look around in the community at other structures. And so, in fact, when we were preparing our presentation for the selection committee in Wellfleet for our project, which has a 3-story building in it, we took photos of other buildings across the street, down the road, and throughout the community that were 3 stories high. And in fact, one of the buildings in Wellfleet that is 3 stories high is the Historical Society building in downtown Wellfleet. So you never know what you're going to find when you really take a look in the community and kind of demonstrate you're really not proposing anything that's really different from other structures that are in the town. And that 3rd story, the 2nd and 3rd stories also, you know, we're not talking about a square like down in the corner there in this illustration on the screen that you know, with different roof lines and kind of varying walls, you can really break up the massing of a larger 3-story building and make it not look so big and city-like.
The other thing I wanted to add was that in 4 of our communities on the Lower Cape, in Truro, in Eastham, in Orleans, and in Brewster, we have some significant land acquisitions that the towns are starting to do some visioning around. And these are really important opportunities to start to embrace some more compact forms, some density. And so that places housing advocates in alignment with open space and conservation advocates to protect open space in those parcels by building more densely rather than covering the entire site. All right, Jay, you want to talk about how it gets built? I don't see any hands. I think we can move on.
Yes. So let me first just kind of highlight a great resource at Mass Housing Partnership and their Housing Toolbox website, that there is a whole series of pages for developers. And so think about that as a municipal official or, you know, serving on a board that you're interested in developing. There are lots of resources here at the MHP website with information about the whole development process. So let's talk a little bit about the development timeline. So first, in order to partner with developers, and I think that this is a really important thing to keep in mind, that municipalities have a really important role to play in producing housing, but actually getting involved in the real estate development business is not a really good role for a municipality. When the municipality tries to be the developer and own the building, you hit up against prevailing wage and very cumbersome procurement processes. And so the best role for a municipality is to provide the land and then create an environment for a partnership with a not-for-profit or a for-profit developer to create the housing. So the first really important thing to be in with is planning. So certainly the housing needs assessment that's been done is a foundational document, and it really provides a great analysis of what is needed. And also in good planning, there's analysis of the implementation capacity, like what is possible for a community to go through. It's really important in doing that beginning stage planning to have some goals of the number of units to produce, and then identifying different strategies to meet those goals. And those goals could be around, how many units do you need? How many of those units should be rental? How many of them should be affordable home ownership? And what various income levels should they serve? And then starting to set some strategies about how to meet those goals. And then finally, the elements of a really good plan include an action plan. So what is the Affordable Housing Committee going to do? What is the Affordable Housing Trust going to do? What is the town planner going to do? And what are the resources that are needed to lay the groundwork for housing production?
I just want to say action plans are one of my favorite things to talk about. I don't know any communities on the Lower Cape that have them. If any community is interested in talking through the value of having an action plan, which is separate from a housing production goal, I would love to talk to you about that. And we're actually working really closely with the town of Wellfleet and with a technical assistance grant from Massachusetts Housing Partnership to go through delineating those roles between the different groups in town that are working on housing and how that fits into an action plan. So would love to talk to you about that offline if that's of interest to you.
So then you need a development strategy and a budget. And this is often done with the Affordable Housing Trust creating an action plan. So a development strategy is really going to outline the who, what, where, and how of the community's housing needs. And it's an extension. It's like the next step after the needs assessment. And there's some great, great resources at the Mass Housing Partnership on creating a development strategy. Next slide. So the first kind of big thing that comes up is sites. So we have different parcels of land, different places in our communities where we think it might be a good place to do housing. And the first thing that's really important to do is an evaluation of that site, to look at what the local zoning is, what state regulations are, any kind of environmental concerns, and to really start doing some very preliminary engineering and conceptual design, and then also some financial feasibility analysis. There may be a parcel of land, but that parcel of land could be really hilly, hard to access, and may have a bunch of environmental concerns, all of which might make developing housing on that site financially unfeasible.
And the only thing I want to add is that it's usually your Affordable Housing Trust that's doing this work. And so when you're thinking about your housing production and the number of sites or sites that you want to develop, you can budget for pre-development and make sure that you do You can also ask Massachusetts Housing Partnership for a technical assistance grant to help you cover the cost of pre-development.
Then I think another thing that's really important to think about too is like this pre-development strategy, kind of process often takes the same amount of time and resources, whether you're going to build 5 units or 50. And we've heard a lot of kind of concerns in our community about scale and density. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is the magnitude of our affordable housing crisis is such that we don't have time to solve this problem 5 units at a time. That we really do need to be exploring projects that are going to make a significant dent in our needs. So once a pre-development analysis has been put out, that's then the time for the town to put out a request for proposals to developers and go through a process for selecting a developer. So writing an RFP is a really complicated process. And I would argue that there are very few experts, even our very talented town planners, who kind of have the skills and expertise available to write an effective RFP. One that is like legal and meets all the legal parameters, but also one that sets down certain guidelines, but doesn't provide so many restraints that it stifles the creativity of developers to offer innovative solutions. And so to write an RFP, get help. And that help is available from Mass Housing Partnership. There are also great development consultants available who can help towns do that. But Laura Schufeld at Mass Housing Partnership has probably been responsible for writing most of the RFPs on the Outer Cape, and she is the person to get to help you to write an RFP. And then it's really important to go through a process to selecting a developer. And we've seen some really great examples of this recently, both in the town of Wellfleet and the town of Provincetown are currently undergoing a selection process. Brewster has done it as well. But you really want to have a good mix of a committee that reviews the proposals. And that committee should absolutely represent a cross-section of the community to give it credibility. But it's also really important that there are people on that committee who have the skills and experience to analyze and evaluate a proposal, or that the town uses some consultants to help with that process and support the committee in making that decision.
And Jay, at the bottom here is a rubric for comparing proposals, and you can get that off of MHP's website. I don't think that we explained what the Housing Toolbox is. We link it to it all over the place, but the Housing Toolbox is a site on Massachusetts Housing Partnership's website that includes everything you need to know about housing production. It's both from a developer perspective and from a municipal perspective, and there's a lot of tools like this that you can download.
So after a developer is selected, then it is time for actually constructing the housing development. And so that developer is typically going to select a general contractor. They will have construction oversight and somebody to oversee the construction to represent them. They will also have created, in order to get subsidies from the state and federal government, they will have had to go through have an affordable fair housing marketing plan that explains the process for marketing and leasing up and conducting a lottery to fill that unit. There will also be a plan for how that development is going to be managed, particularly if it's an affordable rental development. So all of these pieces are part of the kind of construction and getting ready to rent up and fill the unit, the new property. And so once it's done, all the financing is secured, it would be time to get that unit, that property filled. one of the challenges that towns should look at, it could be also be part of the RFP process, is local versus off-Cape management. There are a lot of large for-profit management companies that are based off-Cape that do manage large projects. But there are also local nonprofits such as the CDP and the Housing Assistance Corporation that also manage properties. And I think that there are some real merits of having a local property manager. It means that those management jobs are going to be based here in our community, and I think there's a lot more accountability. And then one of the key parts of managing affordable housing, particularly units that are very low income, is ensuring that there's a partnership with a social service agency to be able to provide support services for residents, so that if a resident misses a month in rent, that you just don't let that accumulate and then evict them. That there is somebody to refer that family to get help, to get support, to look at their financial picture and ensure that they don't end up homeless because they're not able to pay their rent.
Oh, the other thing that I would add is, as far as the municipality's ongoing role after a development is constructed, is if they're affordable units, make sure that they get added to your subsidized housing inventory. There's a form you have to submit, and you have to work with the Department of Housing and Community Development of the state to get that done. And then the town is also going to want to have their housing staff, or sometimes their town planner, they don't have housing staff, to be checking that, what's called SHI, that subsidized housing inventory, over time to make sure that it's accurate, and having a lot of communication with DHCD. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, for the marketing piece for your initial rent up, we encourage towns to connect the developer with your local social service agencies to see if you can review the material, have them review the materials, and make sure that the questions are being laid out in a way that they don't make people self-select non-eligibility, so that people don't read the form and think, this isn't going to apply to me, I'm not going to apply. The way that the questions are posed can make people think that they might not be eligible for something that they are eligible for, and you can deal with that by talking to your local social service agencies like Homeless Prevention Council, for example, to make sure that your forms are good.
So then there is the puzzle of funding sources. In a typical affordable housing development, we'll have many different sources of funds. This is a puzzle, however, that a developer, an experienced developer, will know how to figure out and how to put that together. But we kind of look at two different pots of money. The greatest pot of money are state and federal resources. But in order to unlock those state and federal resources, a community is going to need to have some skin in the game. And so a town is going to need to have local funds available. But those local funds can really leverage significant state and federal funds. So let's talk about some of the sources of local funds, or ways a community can contribute to the project. The first, obviously, is land. And that is actually one of the biggest. There are very, very few affordable housing developments that have been built without land that was provided by the town. And often that land can actually be retained by the town and made available to the developer through a long-term lease, usually like a 99-year ground lease. The town also has a couple different sources of local funds. The first is the Community Preservation Act funds. So, 10% of the CPC dollars, community preservation dollars, actually have to be spent on affordable housing. That, however, is the floor, not the ceiling. And in fact, some of the communities, Provincetown being one of them, require more than 10% of the CPC money be spent on housing. Another vehicle is also creating an affordable housing trust. And I think we pretty much have every town has now created an affordable housing trust. And so this is a place where funds from Community Preservation Act, but also other sources can be handed over to a trust, and the trust has the ability to spend those funds without approval at town meeting. So the town meeting will approve to hand over funds to the trust to use for a broad range of activities, but it becomes a much quicker and easier way for a town to respond to opportunities. Like say a piece of land comes up available for purchase. It will take months to organize a special town meeting, whereas an affordable housing trust can move very quickly to acquire that land or acquire a building to redevelop. An affordable housing trust can source money from lots of different places, from the Community Preservation Committee, through the town of Harwich puts its cell tower lease revenue into its affordable housing trust. The town of Orleans passed an initiative several years ago called 1% for housing. And so 1% of the town's budget that's derived from property taxes and other revenue sources is handed over to the trust annually. It's about $250,000 a year annually. And the biggest opportunity, however, to ensure that our communities have resources to leverage these state and federal resources is now the local option rooms tax money that is coming to towns thanks to the short-term rental tax. And so one of the things that we, for the last year, have been strongly encouraging towns to do is to secure as much as possible of that revenue stream. And I think it makes a lot of sense, actually. We talked earlier about how the short-term rental market has really eviscerated our affordable, our market rate rental housing. And so we really ought to be using the tax that's being derived from those short-term rentals to help solve the problem it has created. And so I would I really hope that all of you are advocating in your communities that a majority, if not all, of the short-term rental tax money should be going in to the Affordable Housing Trust to be used to fix the problem it's created. There's also local home funds and community development block grant funds. The CDBG community development block grant funds are particularly good for the kind of infrastructure for a project. You can also, a town can also vote to use free cash. That's the kind of surplus money that's left over every year. That money can be put into the housing trust. There's also talk about enabling towns to have a transfer fee that would tax real estate transfer. So the sale of particularly high-end real estate in their communities. A number of towns have home rule petitions asking the state to allow that. And there's also talk on Beacon Hill about increasing the deeds excise fee to provide another revenue stream of about $300 million a year statewide that could support housing.
DJ, we have some questions coming in.
Sure. Do you want to go ahead and ask them, Linda?
Yeah, Marcia, do you want to unmute yourself to ask your question?
Jay, as you know, there's been a lot of talk about what is too much subsidy, especially a town subsidy, as opposed to the total development cost per unit. And so I was trying to look at whether there's any compilation of projects and their costs, development costs, construction costs, land costs, town subsidy costs, or is there any entity that can pull that together so that you're comparing apples to apples when you talk about relative costs?
Marcia, that's a really good question. I don't know if anybody has done a compilation. We certainly have some different examples. I'll talk about one in particular in a minute. But I guess the other way to look at that, though, too, is that choices exclude. And so I know that Orleans is confronting this challenge with a small scale project, and the developer is asking for $148,000 per unit where there are other projects where it's only been $30,000 or $40,000 per unit. But just keep in mind that when you do a higher level of subsidy per unit, you're using up money that can't be used for other projects where you're going to get a better deal. And so it's really kind of a balancing act that a community needs to do.
Right, but in
There
this
is.
case,
Go ahead.
Oh, in this case,
there is some effort at the state level, however, to fix the subsidy level on these smaller scale units, but it'd probably be a year or two before that happens.
right, and I just want to point out with the Orleans case, there was a specific goal being achieved. It is still locationally advantageous. It uses architectural design as a way to create an attractive community. It's doing what Andreas talked about. We're using architectural form, but putting multiple units in it. So there was some specific vision involved in that particular project. But being the size it is, you can only fit so many units on it.
Right. And when you get a smaller scale project, when you get below 30 units, you can't use the low income housing tax credit, which it's money from the federal government that's going to provide up to $200,000 per unit. And so then the town has to step in and fill in that gap. Because remember, we got to get to 400,000, typically $400,000 per unit to create the housing.
Right, but as you know, for habitat homes, single family homes, the cost per unit is humongous.
Right. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about some of this. Oh, so another question?
No, I was going to say if you want me to move the slide.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the federal, state and federal funds, and then the example. Again, here's a great resource on the low-income housing tax credit. So that is the major source of funding. It's a federal law that comes administered by the IRS that comes through the state, and it basically, in a very complicated way, leverages investment often by banks and insurance companies in providing equity to affordable housing developers to subsidize the creation of these units. And those units, one of the challenges of the low-income housing tax credit is that it only goes up to 60% of very immediate income, and so it becomes harder to build the units above 60% without those funds. But it is kind of part of the mix, and it's an important source. But you can only use low-income housing tax credit dollars when you have a project that's more than 30 units.
So rather than go into all the other little sources, we've offered you 3 resources here where you can geek out to your heart's content.
Yeah. So let's look at a particular case of what the town of Eastham did in partnering with Penrose, a for-profit developer. So there's here the timeline. This is a project that took 4 years, and that this is a project too where almost everything went perfectly, and it still took 4 years from the time the RFP was issued until we actually had people move into it. But the total project cost $23 million, and here you can see all of the different sources of funding that came in. And so there was $300,000 from the Affordable Housing Trust. There was $750,000 from the Community Preservation Committee. Orleans and Wellfleet each chipped in $100,000 from their CPC funds into this project. But you can see how these local funds then went and leveraged significant funds from the state, from the low-income housing tax credit, and then other debt that there's enough income coming in that the developer can handle some level of debt. And so I think this is the really key thing to keep in mind, is positioning the town so that you've got resources available, because they can then unlock and leverage additional resources. And then also too, if you've got local resources available, and we've talked about, typically in a like the project in Wellfleet that we have proposed, we're asking for $500,000 from the town on a $20 million project. But the more resources that you have available, it allows the town to have more of a say. Like, you might be able to subsidize the increased cost of more energy efficiency. You may be able to subsidize the cost of building some more units that are at the higher end of the income scale or above 80% of AMI. So as we continue to look at how we build it, there is this real balancing act of time and money. And as you can see that, there are all these costs and different sources. But I think one of the biggest variables that can upset this balance is time and predictability. And so the more that a town can position itself by having a really good needs assessment, having a really good RFP, having a really good community engagement process, so that the community is on board and not fighting the project, that the zoning board is prepped and ready to move a project forward, that all can have a huge impact. So let me give you a good example of this. The town of Truro, this is the biggest project that the town has ever tried to undertake, and that's the Cloverleaf project. It took over a year and certainly COVID made this more complicated, but it took over a year of hearings in the zoning board, lots of community opposition. There definitely room for improvement in kind of the community engagement that was done on that project. And now the project is tied up in court. A much better example is what the town of Orleans just recently did with the Cape Cod 5 operations center that is being repurposed. And that permitting process moved through the zoning board in 2 months. And that project is now eligible to start applying for state funding, and is going to get built, even though it started after the Cloverleaf project started. It is going to get built and occupied a lot quicker. And so kind of having balancing all of these issues is really, really important. And then finally, some thoughts about property management. Again, I've talked a little bit already about why local management can really be advantageous. Another thing to keep in mind too is that the more scattered sites you have, the more expensive it is to manage the housing. And managing the housing and the cost of managing housing is really significant. And in fact, in southeastern Massachusetts, the average unit of affordable housing costs over $8,000 per unit per year to manage. Keep in mind that you're only bringing in about $12,000 per year in rent. And in fact, for us at the CDP, where we've got 100 units that we manage in more than 20 different locations, our management costs are 50% more of the average for southeastern Massachusetts. And that's because we've got crews that are spending a lot of time in their trucks driving from one project to the next, making repairs. When you've got 50 units on one site, you have 50 heating mechanisms, whether they be heat pumps or furnaces that are identical. You have 50 all the appliances are all the same. It just becomes a lot cheaper and much more economical to maintain and fix things that get broken. The other thing to think about around property management too is that ideally, you really would like to have on-site property management, and so that 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, there is somebody on site answering questions, observing things on the property, supporting residents. You can only have on-site property management when you've got a development that's got 40 or more units. It's just impossible to economically sustain on-site property management for small units.
All right.
So that any other, do we want to just pause for a minute? Any questions about
Sure,
building?
yeah.
Great Hamlet?
There have been a bunch of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Actually, why don't we wait, because I don't want to decide what's more important than another question.
Okay.
Right now.
Yeah. Great. Okay.
All right. So we talked about how you get it built. Now we're going to talk about strategies to get the best housing in our communities. I'm going to kick us off with community engagement, and then Jay is going to take over at infrastructure. So community engagement is first, because I really think that it's one of the most critical pieces to advancing housing production in your town. And when we talk about community engagement, we're talking about one-way or ideally two-way exchange of information between the municipality and the residents of the community. And it can start way before any site has even been identified for a housing development. It really is about making sure that the people in your community are A, part of the conversation, and B, have a shared vision of the needs of the housing needs of the community and how to get there. I think Brewster's vision plan was really telling, because anytime they have a conversation about a specific project or program, they always can go back to that vision plan and say, hey, you all said that this was important. We're doing what you said is important. And they just have this shared vision, and it really allows for a higher quality discourse within the town and a lot more public support. This is an interesting graphic from an app, actually, that can be used to do community engagement, usually in cities because it is a little bit expensive. But there has been talk around the state of smaller communities getting together to share the cost. This is an app that's useful for a specific development, and I'll let you go to their website and learn more about them. But they do have an interesting way of thinking about who the stakeholders are in your community when you're trying to target your community engagement. Community engagement is typically something that's done by your affordable housing committee or your local housing partnership, depending on what you have in your town. Outreach and education is typically a really good role for that group to do. It takes a lot of time and energy to do it well, and it's nice to have it be someone's job, a group's job. You can use it for various situations. One is for planning, whether you're coming up with your local comprehensive plan, or more likely your strategic plan, or even your housing production plan. Including a community engagement component where you're doing a survey is probably the easiest thing to do and not necessarily the most impactful. Focus groups, some kind of pop-up activity where you're getting feedback from people in real time through an interesting activity that can engage people at different ages, like maybe children. There's just all kinds of strategies that you can use. That can be part of a planning effort. You can also do community engagement. You should do community engagement for a specific project or a program. So, you know, Brewster's Millstone, Village at Nauset Green in Eastham, Cloverleaf, they had forums for the public. Tea Time in Eastham is done a survey, focus groups, forums. You want to create as many different ways of engaging people as possible, and you want to make sure that you are targeting the demographics that are missing in your results. So definitely for specific development, you have something really specific to talk about, but then also just all the time, you know, if housing isn't a part of the regular conversation in town and it's only talked about when there's a development that comes up, you're allowing for space for opposition. It's much more effective to have a culture of learning, to build a culture of support around housing production in your town way before you're talking about a specific site. And you do that by talking about the needs of housing in your town all the time, all year round, in different ways. And when it comes to thinking about who's going to do the engagement, it's really great to delineate specific roles between the different groups in town that are working on housing production. So these are the typical players that could be part of your engagement team and have different roles. Your housing partnership or housing committee, like I said, they tend to be focused on advocacy. Your affordable housing trust, this is the entity that's going to be taking the lead on the development of a specific project, but they have a role in your community engagement, particularly in providing information that you're going to be using to communicate with the public. Your planning board can offer information on zoning and master planning. And then of course your town staff and perhaps a consultant, if you've contracted with one, can help you structure a community engagement strategy that's going to reach everyone in your community, not just the people who show up at town meetings, not just the people who actually look at your town website, which is very few people, but really get your tendrils out into the community and reach people that might be difficult to reach, to make sure that you have diverse perspectives feeding into the understanding of need in your community and why the housing is so important. As I mentioned, for planning, these are the different situations where it would be useful to get community input. Basically, you always want to be including community members into any conversation that you're having about housing from the very beginning. And your task is to make sure that the information you're putting out is clear and consistent, whether you're putting it on your website or social media. You want to make sure that you're using similar messaging and they're really bringing people along for the journey rather than just waiting for the ZBA hearings that are part of the developer applying for a comprehensive permit, because that's when, for lack of a better word, the vitriol and the opposition comes out. You want to make sure that you're setting your community up for success because you've been having these conversations all along. Again, for a specific development, you want to be doing all different kinds of community engagement. And you also want to be doing some organizing because you want to make sure that, again, you're reaching the people who aren't usually reached and you're building support among people who need the housing. Oftentimes in public hearings, for example, we hear from people who have feelings about the development, but they're not the people who necessarily need the housing. We need to be hearing from the people who embody the need. And those people are usually like me. We have small children. We're working long hours. Some people are working multiple jobs. And a lot of people are really uncomfortable with speaking at a town meeting or a public hearing. And so they require support. And you can do that by reaching out to folks, providing talking points, educating them on issues that concern them so that people who need housing can advocate for their own needs as well.
Andrea, can I just add an example to some engagement for a specific project? So Wellfleet's Lawrence Road Task Force, which is the group that worked to develop the RFP for the site for these 46 units in Wellfleet, did, even as part of developing the RFP, did a big community engagement meeting. And in fact, this summer when the RFP went out, that committee held several meetings in the homes of the neighbors of the site. So really don't wait until the neighbors talk amongst themselves and develop opposition. At the very early stages of the process, you want to knock on doors and invite neighbors to have sit-down discussion so that you can really present the project to them, get their input, address their concerns, and nip a lot of the NIMBYism in the back, in the bud before it turns into full-on opposition.
Oh, that reminds me of another point that I wanted to make, which is when you're doing community engagement, a lot of the time what you're trying to understand is what the wants and desires of the community are. And while this is really important information to have so that you can weave some of that into your RFP, it's equally important, if not more important, to prioritize and balance that data with all of the planning work that your community has already done through your housing production plan, through your local comprehensive plan, through your strategic plan. Because if your engagement suggests that the people who are answering your surveys don't necessarily want a lot of housing, but your housing needs assessments show that there's tremendous need, you really need to be addressing the need and then bringing the community along through your engagement strategy. And then as far as ongoing education, I wanted to make sure that everyone knows about the work of Dr. Tiffany Manuel. A lot of community engagement is about using the right messages, not to be salesy, but to make sure that you're using language that people can really hear and really understand. There's a lot of fear mongering that goes on in the housing production space, and that type of language can really hinder your progress. So Dr. Tiffany Manuel wrote a book and has this website, thecasemaid.com. She has fabulous resources around how to talk about housing so that it makes sense to the people in your community. All right, Jay, you take over with infrastructure. You're muted.
So as I alluded to earlier, the availability of water, sewer, and other infrastructure is absolutely critical to being able to unlock possibilities for building housing. And so without these things in place, it's really hard to leverage those public dollars effectively for housing. So we need water, sewer, land. We want the housing located where there is good transportation or places where people can walk and bike. There is also, however, state money available to help with creating these. And several towns have used money from mass development to put in a water line to the Cloverleaf site in Truro to handle the creation of the road and water at a project in Brewster, to bring the water line in Wellfleet to the Lawrence Road site. And so again, if a town can prepare that infrastructure, only the town can apply for MassWorks dollars. But that's one less thing that a developer has to worry about and spend money on. So really think about what is it that the town can do to make sure that the infrastructure is in place for housing. So the other thing in terms of what do we need to set ourselves up for success, we clearly need better zoning. And so village-centered, transit-oriented zoning is really important, making it so that on a bus line or where there's transportation, we have the ability to make more zoning. Also allowing zoning by right. So the 6 months or a year that has to be spent permitting a project just adds to its expense. All of the studies that have to be done, the peer review of those studies, the consultants, all of that just adds a cost. And so if a town can decide, you know what, in these kind of limited areas, this is where it makes sense to have more density and to have multifamily housing, and we ought to allow it by right, that will unlock the power of private sector development and private sector money to be able to do housing. You know, we've also talked a bit about accessory dwelling units and made significant changes in accessory dwelling unit bylaws. So these are what are sometimes called in-law apartments. So it's like building out an apartment in that space above a garage, or you know, dividing some space in a house and turning it into a separate dwelling. And we've made it a lot easier to build those in our lower Cape towns. And we've also made it, and this is also an area where we can often create housing that is what we referred to earlier as the naturally occurring affordable housing. You know, it doesn't require government subsidy, it doesn't require income limits. But the only thing that we've done in changing these accessory dwelling unit bylaws is required that they be rented out year round, so that they don't end up in the Airbnb, you know, short-term rental market. One of the things I think it's a little bit challenging, however, still for accessory dwelling units is that the typical homeowner is not a real estate developer. And so at the CDP, it is our plan early next year to launch an accessory dwelling unit resource center. So this would be a place where homeowners who want to build an accessory dwelling unit can have one place to come and get help in dealing with the design, the financing, the permitting, the construction, and then actually being a landlord, that all of those resources and all that support for homeowners would be in place. This is also a great way too for many homeowners who maybe, you know, have excess room in their homes, who are living on a fixed income, can create a source of supplemental income by being able to rent out part of their house as an accessory dwelling. I talked earlier about the importance of local funding to be able to partner with the developer. There's some great resources on the different local funding sources that CHAPA and the Mass Association of Community Development Corporations websites. So there's a couple different ways to kind of leverage local funding and resources. There are different types, as I mentioned, the short-term rental tax, the marijuana tax, free cash, CPC funding. There was a question or comment in the chat about lots of other different sources of revenue, different fees. There's something else too called inclusionary zoning. Provincetown has inclusionary zoning, so that if a developer wants to build a certain number of units, some of those units have to be affordable, or they have to deposit funds into the Affordable Housing Trust so that those units can be built someplace else. So lots of different places to get revenue, and it's really important that our towns have that those funds available, particularly the short-term rental tax. And there's an op-ed that Hadley Luddy at Homeless Prevention Council and I wrote in the Provincetown Independent about a year ago that focuses on the importance of using rooms tax dollars for housing.
And I wanted to make sure that people know that our next workshop is going to be on November 5th. It's called How to Fund Community Housing, and we'll be focusing on what to do with the short-term rental tax and the mechanisms for allocating it for housing.
So it's also really important to have a strong, functioning affordable housing trust, and there are great resources available from Mass Housing Partnership, and we also have great experience with the CDP of being able to help trust think about creating an action plan. I believe almost every town now has a municipal affordable housing trust, which is the best state structure for a trust. There's also a strategy of creating a separate trust, as the town of Provincetown has done, a year-round market rate rental trust. So this is something that can be done through a home rule petition. It needs to go through the state legislature, but Senator Sear and Rep. Peake have a great experience in moving those through the legislature. But I think the most important thing to think about, though, is that for housing trusts is to try to create a stable and predictable revenue source. One of the advantages of doing that, so for example, having all or a significant portion of the short-term rental tax going to the trust, that positions the trust actually to go out and borrow money. And right now, borrowing money is really cheap. To be able to go out and borrow $10 million to contribute to a project and have a stable revenue source that can then pay off that financing. And then finally, one of, I think, the most important things that a town can do is to have somebody in town hall whose job it is to focus on housing. And I would say it's not part of their job is to focus on housing, but that is their sole responsibility. And I think, Provincetown and Michelle Jeroschewitz's amazing tenure as being the housing coordinator there for over a decade is real evidence of all of the housing that's been created in Provincetown. Has largely happened certainly because of public support, but it's been somebody's job in town hall to move the housing agenda forward. And most of the Lower Cape towns are now creating these kinds of positions or in town hall to be able to move housing forward. And then finally, regional collaboration is really key. And so one of the things that we've done to try to support regional collaboration is the Lower and Outer Cape peer groups. It's an opportunity every quarter for folks involved in housing in our towns to get together and meet and share notes and share strategies. And we've also seen several examples of towns financially supporting housing production in other towns. So, the towns of Wellfleet and Orleans contributed to the Village at Nauset Green project in Orleans. The Cape Cod 5 operations headquarters redevelopment that's happening, that the developers has been going out and seeking contributions from neighboring towns who may have some CPC funds available to support that. So it's another model of regional collaboration.
All right, we did it. We're just going to wrap up real quick. If anyone needs to leave at noon, we certainly respect that. Jay and I are going to stick around to answer questions, and you're welcome to stay with us. So that's in a nutshell the most the most important concepts that we can put in a presentation without going too deep into anything. But any one of these bubbles could have been a whole other hour. I want to make sure that you all are aware that this is just the beginning of the Lower Cape Housing Institute for this year. Like I said, we have a How to Fund Community Housing workshop coming up in November. And then we're going to do a Community by Design workshop in January. I'm probably most excited about a workshop in March on the history of land use policy on Cape Cod. This is something that I have never heard spoken about before. And so the idea there is to kind of understand how we got here and what strategies we need to employ to get out of it. And then we'll do our annual housing coordinator roundtable for housing staff. And there might be some new faces that can be part of that this year, since town have been creating new positions. We will, of course, continue our quarterly sub-regional peer group meetings. These are specifically for municipal officials and town staff. Our next ones take place in mid-December. And I think that's all I want to say. Any parting thoughts, Jay, before we move to questions?
No, thank you all for attending, and we'll certainly stick around for a while and answer questions. And we'll also copy the chat for people who may have had to leave or do need to leave soon, and try to do a summary and some response to the questions that are there. Great.
I think the last thing I want to say is that I'm going to stop the recording now to do the questions, but this, like I said, is going to be a live link that we're going to share with everybody. So if you have a peer in your town board or committee who couldn't be here today, please do share the recording and the presentation with them. It's also going to be posted on our YouTube channel. All right.